Well, first things first, to those of you who are physically here, thank you not just for braving a pandemic, but also braving the best of London's weather to make it out. And to those of you who are joining us online, well done. I think you made a very sensible choice to stay at home. I'm going to talk you through some of our latest research entitled A Changed World, where we're looking at the state of digital transformation in a post-COVID maritime industry. And then I'll be joined by an esteemed panel of experts who will answer all the really difficult questions, so I don't have to. First, though, does anyone recognise this man or have any idea who he might be? If you do, you're welcome to shout out. Silence. I didn't think you would, but his name is Charles Midgley Jr., and he's actually credited as the man who harmed the planet more than anyone else in history. And I'll tell you a story as to where all of that came about. The 1920s was a decade of a sort of motor car boom. So between 1907 and 1928, the production of motor cars in the US, it increased by nearly 100-fold. So we went from 45,000 vehicles being made a year to 4.4 million vehicles being made a year. Early on in the decade, a new invention by this man promised to drastically increase the performance of the internal combustion engine. And it just so happened that adding lead to petrol had a dramatic increase on a car's performance. It boosted the engine's performance, it boosted the octane power of the fuel, and it massively reduced the maintenance requirements. It came along at about the same time as fuel manufacturing was being scaled up to sort of rapidly serve this really fast-growing market. It was cheap to manufacture, and it was very quickly adopted by petrol manufacturers around the world after being rolled out in 1921. 3 years later, in 1924, a worker at a petrol refining plant in New Jersey began hallucinating. The next day, he was running around the plant, screaming in terror, and 2 days later, he was dead. 4 more of his colleagues died within a week, and then 35 of the 49 employees at the plant ended up seriously ill in hospital. The cause of the mass sickness was lead poisoning, brought about by the leaded petrol manufacturing process. Even at the time, in 1924, the connection between lead and poisoning was well known. Despite that, it took campaigners and scientists about 5 decades before lead was eventually banned in petrol. Over the following decades, scientists found that the use of leaded petrol was linked to heart disease, cancer, strokes, issues with brain development, and even, in some cases, levels of violent crime. It began to be phased out in the 1970s through economic incentives, changes to car design, and eventually outright bans. It wasn't until the 1990s, though, that major economies actually banned the fuel at the pumps. The US banned it in 1996. The UK and EU eventually followed suit in 2000. But does anyone want to hazard a guess as to when leaded petrol was actually phased out globally around the world? Silence. August 2021 is when we finally got rid of leaded petrol. So we went from 1924, realizing there was a problem, all the way to 2021 before we were able to completely change the fuel supply infrastructure. We knew the risks were there. There was harrowing evidence of the potential for it to take lives as early as 1924, but it took a century to actually get it out of the fuel supply chain. Part of the reason for that is sort of pseudoscience that was funded by some vested interests that obscured the damage done. But really, by the time the damage was known, it was so fully ingrained in the automotive industry and also in consumer behaviour that moving away from it required an enormous overhaul of the entire industry. Things like the cost of transforming older car engines to run on unleaded, the marginally higher cost of the fuel itself, and the slow rollout of that fuel to petrol stations meant it took a long time. So we can draw lessons. This is the last pump to use it in Algeria. We can draw lessons from that eventual sort of phase out and ban when we look at the decarbonisation of the global shipping industry. achieving net zero will require an overhaul of the industry that's so utterly enormous that it makes the century-long campaign to remove a poisonous additive from petrol look pretty straightforward. As an aside, Charles Midgley Jr. also invented CFC gases that put a hole in the ozone layer. But he died before he realised, so he never actually learned what a number he did on the world. There are three things I'd like to talk about this morning. First is the pandemic effect. So what has the pandemic done to the state of digital transformation in the maritime industry? The second is the UK's position as a maritime technology hub. And then the third, coming back to what I was just talking about, is this question around digital decarbonisation. So let's start with the pandemic effect. First things first, I think what we've seen in the last year, 18 months, absolutely has been a massive boom in digitalisation. But we're not necessarily yet at the stage where we're seeing genuine digital transformation. What I mean by that is that taking a physical or an analog process and putting it online, you could argue is digital transformation, is digitalisation, sorry. Completely redesigning the process from the bottom up to work in a digital world is digital transformation. We've all seen in the last 18 months the shift onto online meetings, onto Zoom, onto Teams, which I think you could argue is a digitalisation of an analog meeting. What we've not yet seen really in the industry, but we have seen it in other industries like software, is the move to things like totally decentralised working, where there are no meetings, because you work in a collaborative way using collaborative platforms. Those are the sorts of changes that we're just starting to see happen in the industry, and I would say that the pandemic has been a massive accelerant of the former, which is a precursor to the latter. So to put some numbers behind that, when we were asked to look at to try and quantify what the impact of the pandemic could have been on the digital transformation of the industry, and quantifying something like that is really, really difficult. The good news, though, is that we'd previously done forecasts of the markets, of the global market size up to 2030, and we operate an intelligence platform that sort of gives us a view of it all the time. And so we were able to go back to our data from 2019 and look at our previous market forecasts, because obviously they didn't include a pandemic, and then look at the impact of the last 2 years or so, and put those two together to show us what we've got here, which is essentially that there's a bit of a slump through 2020 and then a bit of a bump. So previous forecasts that we did 2019 before the pandemic, we were estimating that the total turnover of digital technologies within the maritime industry would be about $124 billion. The actual turnover we estimate in 2020 was about 122. So it was ever so slightly lower than we were previously forecasting. We think what we saw and what's tracked in this chart is technologies that are specific to the maritime industry. So I think what we saw is actually a huge investment in IT infrastructure. So things like moving into Zoom and Teams and remote ways of working. And that lay the ground for what we see here, this massive bump in 2021. So for 2021, our pre-pandemic forecast for the size of the digital maritime industry was about 135 billion. But the pandemic, as you can see, has caused a bit of an explosion in growth. So we're estimating now, our current forecast is that globally, maritime digital products and services will turn over 159 billion. So it's a $24 billion increase, an increase of about 18% on previous forecasts. So there is the sort of quantified effect of the pandemic on the digital maritime sector. By our forecast, by 2022, spend would be about 3 years ahead of where it would have been if there wasn't a pandemic. So there absolutely has been a leap forward. And that leap does sort of level off, as long as there's no other pandemics. And that takes so that we think we're forecasting that the growth level will come back just sort of in line with global economic forecasts up to 2030. So we've actually revised up our market forecast from 345 billion, from 279 billion to 345 billion. So the impact of this in 10 years' time will be huge, and it's has made it quite an exciting space to be in. There you go. The pandemic has accelerated the growth of spend on digital technologies by at least 3 years. It's also had a massive impact on venture investments. So we track venture investments in the industry. In 2020, the volume of deal flow, so the blue bars are the number of deals happening in the sector, and the red line is the total value of deals. So the deal flow dropped by only about 25%, but the value of those deals dropped by a massive 76%. So we went from about 1.4 billion invested into the maritime industry in 2019, down to about 345 million in 2020. So what we think we're seeing here is that there was the early stage venture investing, so smaller deal sizes for earlier stage companies weren't really impacted. That all seemed to move to remote very quickly. But bigger deals for larger companies, there was near enough a total stop on it, which is where you see that dip. However, the picture has improved drastically. I'm sure you'll agree by looking at that in 2021. Deal flow and investments are significantly up, and actually you can almost follow that red line up. We're sort of back on the trend of where we were originally forecasting. So in the year to August 2021, so this year so far, $1.7 billion has been invested in startups and scale-ups within the maritime sector from venture capital funds. We're forecasting at the moment that by the end of the year, by the end of 2021, somewhere in the region of $2.5 billion would have been invested. So deal flow as well is up by sort of 85% on 2020 levels. So this brings investment sort of back in line to what we were originally forecasting, and it's been a quick recovery. So second, what's the UK's position? Well, since 2008, the UK has produced the highest number of maritime technology businesses in the G7 that are specifically related to ship operations and management. So we are absolutely seeing the UK become a bit of a hub for any technologies that are aimed at improving the ship operations and management space. That group, that ship operations and management technology sector, makes up about 40% of all UK maritime technology startups. And it's about a fifth of all of the technology companies operating globally in that sector. The UK is also the second most abundant source of cloud computing, data and analytics, and artificial intelligence companies for the maritime sector, behind the US. The US is still very much the leader, still very much gets, certainly attracts much bigger ticket sizes and investment sizes, but the UK sort of comes in a second place. We also have a really strong sort of vessel autonomy and robotics sector. There's quite a large number of small startup and SME manufacturers are operating in that space. So around 40% of the UK's maritime technology companies are working in process automation, robotics, hardware, and autonomous surface shipping. The UK government set out in 2019 their Maritime 2050 strategy. With that came some short-term goals, some medium-term goals, and some long-term goals. The short-term goals were focused on actually hitting the achievements by 2025. And what we've done as part of the research, which publishes next week, which I'm assuming everyone who's in this room or watching online will be sent a copy of. The UK government set out targets covering UK's competitive advantage, technology, people, environment, trade, infrastructure, and security and resilience. Various different goals were set, and we've done a little bit of an exercise to try and establish where we're actually at against them. Good news is that progress has been really strong in areas such as trade, which kind of makes sense with it being a bit of a strategic priority after Brexit. Technology and people, they're all around sort of 70% of the way complete to the goals that were set for 2025. and also UK competitive advantage. But much less progress has been made under the themes of environment, infrastructure, and security and resilience. But security is a bit of a difficult one for us to judge because so much information is actually withheld from the public. The UK digital maritime market has seen a very, very similar pattern to what happened globally. So our pre-pandemic forecast estimated that the industry would turn over about $7 billion. So that's $5.1 billion pounds in 2021. Based on the data collected to August this year, we estimate the industry will actually turn over about $8.6 billion. So we've seen, roughly speaking, a $1.6 billion boost, or 23% increase, because of sort of post-pandemic spending on maritime technologies. Then lastly, we've got this issue of digital decarbonisation. I think the natural school of thought when we look at decarbonisation is to think about zero emission fuels or net zero fuels and the infrastructure that's going to be required for those, and I think that's absolutely right to do. But the reality is, as I hope I demonstrated earlier, is that it will take a long, long time to build the infrastructure required for that, to make that possible. So based on this, I like to think of decarbonisation along three sort of separate time horizons. So the furthest away is the creation of the infrastructure to distribute zero emission fuels to where they need to be, sort of, and ensuring that when a ship calls at any port in the world, that fuel that is net zero is available to it. Otherwise, we can build as many ships as we like that could run on net zero fuels, but if the fuels just aren't available, it's pointless. So we kind of see from 2040 onwards that infrastructure should be starting to be put into place. The second nearest to us is the development of net zero fuels themselves. So things like hydrogen and ammonia, and the construction of hybrid ships that can run both on fossil fuels and on net zero fuels. And we've just started to see that in the last month or so, with Maersk placing an order for 8 hybrid vessels that will be able to run on traditional fossil fuels or ammonia. But then the nearest time horizon to us, sort of today up to about 2030, we think where we can have the biggest impact is actually in the use of digital tools to improve the ton-mile efficiency of the industry as it is today. There's a huge number of examples out there. It's actually sort of a dizzying array of examples, but I thought I'd just put one up to show you, because they've had some really fascinating results. This is a screenshot from a company called BlueFlow Energy Management. They're a small Swedish technology SME. They've done a huge amount of work in the ferry sector recently. And I just apologise to any Swedes listening, but they've been working with the ferry company Styrsöbolaget. Apologies. They operate a fleet of 18 ships in and around the Swedish archipelago. About 10 years ago, they put BlueFlow onto 4 of their ships, just as a bit of a trial. And a year after that, they rolled it out across the whole fleet. What the system does is it monitors fuel consumption through a voyage, and then it nudges the captains and it nudges the officers who are actually on the sticks driving the thing, just small changes that they can make to their behaviour that would improve the efficiency of their handling. Simple things like acceleration rates, deceleration rates, speed versus ETA, handling coming on and off the berth, nothing huge. For some of the captains in the fleet that took part in those early trials, they were able to achieve 50% reductions in fuel consumption on the same route than before they had the system in place. And there was initially, and there's a great case study, it's well worth reading, there was initially a lot of hesitance among the captains in the fleet. They didn't want necessarily to be monitored in this way. But what they found is that once they started sharing what works and what doesn't among them, that it became a hugely effective learning tool for everyone. The result is that over the last 10 years, across the entire fleet, so across 18 ships, they've managed to achieve a sort of ton-mile efficiency fuel reduction of 20% across the fleet. And that's just one very simple digital tool that helps you change how you're driving a ship. It doesn't do anything to the actual structure of the vessel, doesn't do anything with the machinery performance. It's just behavioural changes. And I think when you look at what can be done with something like that, and then look at all of the other areas where we can optimise energy use on a vessel, all of a sudden it becomes quite exciting. And I think while we're waiting for innovators and people far smarter than I to come up with new fuels, test them, and the funding is there to do that increasingly. And while we're waiting for that infrastructure to be developed, I think there's a huge amount that we could achieve in the next 10 years to get us towards the 2050 goals. So to bring that to some kind of conclusion before I invite the panelists onto the stage, Decarbonisation's biggest challenge facing the industry. No new information there, but pretty obvious. But I think it's a point that's worth emphasising again and again and again. COVID has massively increased digitalisation and the use of digital tools across the industry, but not necessarily digital transformation yet. We're not really necessarily massively changing the way that we work. We're just sort of taking analogue processes into digital. Spend on digital tools is now 3 years ahead of where we were expecting it to be based on the pre-pandemic forecasts. We definitely had a bit of a slump in 2020, which I think was understandable, but I think all of the investment that was made into digital infrastructure across the industry is really paying off now. And UK government's broadly on track to reach short-term goals of the Maritime 2050 strategy. Long-term goals, I think, will require a bit more of a commitment to funding. So if there is anyone in the civil service watching, DFT or anything like that, I think we definitely need more of things like the Clean Maritime Challenge. So that's it from me. What I'd like you to do, if you're in the audience, is to log on to Slido using LISW21. Oh, look at that. It's like magic. And while you do that, I will invite our panelists onto the stage, two of which will appear by magic digitally, but those who are here physically, I'd like to welcome Mike Timoth, the CEO of Aviation, Clara Awanish, the Digital Partnerships Manager for Inmarsat, and Mark Darley, Marketing Manager at Lloyd's Register, and I hope Dan White, the CEO of Signal, will appear online. And Nicholas Kerner, the investment manager for Bernard Schulte Ship Management, should also appear online at some point. And while we wait for them, I'll make sure I can get back online. Perfect. With Slido. Ah, look at that. Hi, gents. How are you doing? I don't know where to look. Let's start, if we may, with, let's just work our way down the panel. And perhaps I think it's always better if someone gives their own introduction than for me to butcher it. So could we perhaps just have everyone on the panel, starting with you, Mike, just give us a bit of an introduction to who you are, your background, and what brings you here today.
Sure, thanks, Nick. So Mike Timoth, I'm the MD at Aviation. We're building what we believe is the world's first ultra-long endurance uncrewed surface vessel powered by liquid hydrogen. And we're a very early stage startup. We start cutting steel next week on the prototype vessel, which we'll be testing in March next year. With my secondary hat on, I'm also an entrepreneurship mentor for the British Royal Navy's innovation program, the Percy Hobart Fellowship. So very honoured to be here.
Hello, I'm Clara Awanish, Digital Innovation Partnerships Lead at Inmarsat. So my role is really to lead the engagement with external innovators, find out how we can best collaborate with them, how we can create programs that lead to practical outcomes for the startups, for us, for our end customers. And as an aside, I have also a specific interest in crew welfare and working on the crew welfare strategy for Inmarsat.
Morning everybody, my name's Mark Darley. I'm the Global Head for Lloyd's Register's Marine and Offshore business. effectively in charge of our 2,000 plus surveyors around the world in 80 countries, delivering our classification services.
And on this screen, Nicholas is next. Nicholas, can you hear us?
Okay, hi, I'm Niklas Kerner. I'm in charge of venture capital activities in Europe. And I lead stage startups and on the maritime and logistics space.
And Dan?
Hi, I'm Dan White. I think I've got a better internet connection than Nicholas. I'm the CEO of Signal. We're a UK startup that is focused on changing fuel efficiency behaviours. We started in aviation. We've recently started some really exciting projects in shipping. We use a combination of behavioural economics and data analytics to give feedback to motivate us to make better fuel efficiency decisions.
Perfect. I'd like, if I may, Dan, to stay with you, because I know in the conversations we've had around decarbonisation and digitalisation, it's an area that you're looking at, or have looked at quite heavily in the aviation industry. It would be interesting to, perhaps to start with, just hear a bit about your experience in aviation and how you've been able to port that over to, or have you been able to port that over to maritime?
Yeah, thank you. The short answer to the question is, it seems so. It's early days, but our story began with a randomized control trial with the airline Virgin Atlantic, which our team with other academics did, and showed that by improving the performance of, by providing feedback to airline captains about their own individual performance against fuel efficiency margins, was in fact the lowest ever measured marginal abatement cost for carbon dioxide emissions. What that means is that project effectively discovered the fastest and most efficient way to reduce carbon at scale. Off the back of that, we developed a software platform and a combination of COVID and also some really innovative folks in the maritime industry that were watching what we were doing in aviation led to us starting 2 projects this year in shipping. One of which is we've looked at a large amount of over 200,000 voyages where we've identified that the variance in human performance in the maritime sector is actually greater than in aviation. What this effectively means is the human potential or changing human behavior has arguably a much bigger effect in shipping than it does in aviation. And that means that the opportunity in providing this quite straightforward method of individual feedback has a lot of opportunity to save fuel and the costs associated with that fuel, which are obviously commercial and environmental. So we're super excited about where this is going, but it's really early days.
And Mark, Dan mentioned COVID there, or a combination of COVID and a few other things, being a bit of an accelerant on their journey. But I'd be interested to learn from you as a classification society who normally would send people all around the world to visit ships, carry out inspections. How did COVID impact your operations, and then how have you been able to adapt to deal with this sort of new world we're working in?
Yeah, sure. So you touched on it quite a bit, actually, Nick, in your opening presentation. I think, you know, if we can sort of cast our minds back to the heydays of last summer, and you know, various countries were in various stages of lockdown around the world, and what we were seeing is that we could no longer sort of postpone the activities that we need to do, i.e. get on board ships, look at what we need to look at and issue the certificates to continue the ship's trading and keep the supply chains happening around the world. So it was really about this time last year that we saw a massive accelerant really in the sort of pull from the industry in terms of remote survey techniques, and I think like a lot of us, it took us a bit by surprise, and we went through sort of various iterations of our remote solution. You know, going from the very early days where it was effectively the chief engineer and his mobile phone, and then he would send us the file, through to what we announced last week, which is the LR remote app powered by Inmarsat, which you know, what we've learned in that 12 months is really that connectivity is key. But I think as well, the more interesting thing for me is really around now the use of data in enabling decarbonisation, because I think you're absolutely spot on, Nick. You know, I'm an engineer, I'm a naval architect, and the industry historically is driven by, you know, very sort of prescriptive legislation, and we've had this sort of hurry up and wait mentality really when in terms of new regulation being implemented on board ships. But you know, the world has become a lot more collaborative during the pandemic, and you know, competitors as well as companies from outside the maritime industry now working together on those 2Ds that we've spoken about, you know, for 24, 36 months, decarbonisation and digitisation. But I think, you know, the more and more people that can acknowledge and recognise just how powerful an enabler the use of data in supporting the decarbonisation challenge will be, you know, exactly as you outlined, the quicker we can get where we need to get to because of the prescriptive regulations and because of what various companies are trying to do now.
And Clara, Mark mentioned there a kind of pull from industry to, you know, to want to be moving to remote surveys and wanting to be embracing digital. What have you seen in the last 18 months through your work and your experience, you know, finding innovative technology companies and getting them in front of shipping companies?
Yeah, so I mean, with COVID, I guess the first thing to say is that the immediate impact was that we saw shipping companies, some shipping companies upgrading their connectivity plan. You know, a lot of it to enable their crew to access the internet, but also to enable digital applications. In a few months, we saw a doubling of the data that was consumed by shipping companies, by our customers. And the trend is continuing. The level of data consumed is still higher than pre-COVID times. And we immediately saw the need and the opportunity for remote surveys, hence the partnership with Lloyd's Register. And we saw that, you know, the services that we could provide, reliable connectivity, and also a way for shipping companies to access these services that require high bandwidth, could be enabled in a cost-efficient way. They would, in the partnership, for example, that we have with Lloyd's Register, they wouldn't have to change their plan to enable this service. So there was a validation of what we were trying to do, what we were trying to deploy to the market in terms of dedicated bandwidth enabling critical operations, but also collection of sensor data and sending them to the cloud and onshore. So again, as you mentioned, you know, for voyage optimization, accessing data and optimizing is getting more important. But we also saw more demand for content for the crew, so training, but also entertainment, media, access to news, etc. So it was quite a sudden acceleration, but we see that the trend is continuing.
And Nicholas, I've been watching you on the screen. You're looking very smooth, and it looks like you're with us. So I'll ask you a question, and we'll see how we get on with your connection. Clara mentioned there about effectively the connectivity, or the increased connectivity, provides a little bit of a platform to be able to try out all sorts of digital tools that might help, whether it's improve the ship's performance or provide welfare services to the crew, or just generally dealing with the pandemic. I'd be interested to hear from you, as someone who spends a lot of your time helping BSM as a company implement new technologies from startups and also working with startups. How do projects like those function in a pandemic, and is there anything that you've learned in the last 18 months that you could share with us?
Yeah, I hope my 4G connection is fast enough now. Almost feels like being on a vessel. But yeah, I think, you know, the projects that we work on, they are really, really interesting. And I think, you know, the key is to really, really I think for us, the big challenge was to actually get access to the crew, because we, in the beginning, tried remote inspection services, for instance, using augmented reality, so through a Microsoft HoloLens system, but we couldn't really actually get the systems on board the vessels. So any kind of open innovation activity was very difficult to execute. But at the same time, within the organization, the people or our colleagues got more open to try out new things and to consider using more digital tools. So I think it all started with people being at home and having to do their work life through Zoom and Teams. So I think overall the organization got more open towards trying out new systems, and that also, especially in the fleet teams, trying it out on board vessels, even though, of course, it was difficult to get solutions, or at least hardware on board the vessels. The second problem was, and I think still is, the connectivity on board, because many systems and many tools require fast internet connection. So therefore, I think it's great what Clara mentioned, that that Inmarsat saw that there's increased demand for upgrading packages, and I think that's one of the most important things that owners need to do, in my opinion, and managers.
Mike, Nicholas mentioned a general willingness to embrace new tech, and I think what Acura is doing is right on the cutting edge of that. Could you perhaps just explain to us a little bit what it's been like starting a new company and trying to build physical hardware during a pandemic?
It's a really interesting time. I guess there's a massive desire from larger corporates and organizations to embrace startups, to look at new technologies. So there's a real sort of warmth. There's a real sort of growth and opportunities, and a realization that data, smart moving, agile sort of technologies are the way forward. So that's been sort of really beneficial. It's also, just from a practical perspective, it's actually quite a cost-effective time to start up a new business. You've not got the overheads of office spaces. You know, there was a supply of talent available. You had people who had spent their lives in corporate organizations who were looking at what are the opportunities to go out and do something new and different. So we really sort of embrace that from a time perspective. But you're right, there is, building physical hardware remains a huge challenge. And actually, when we're talking about digitalization as a wider sort of trend, sort of within the maritime sector, it's also important not to forget that actually a lot of this is dependent on physical hardware. And there are sort of, hard tech is still a very, very tough space for startups to raise investment. Investors are sort of very, very cautious when it comes to big capital investments. Putting ships in the sea is not cheap. But I think what there is really a sort of a desire is to pull together an ecosystem, and it's about partnership and collaboration. And that for us has been absolutely critical. So we've established some great supply chains here in the UK, and I think COVID also coincided with some big sort of geopolitical shifts, and the UK's relationship with the rest of the world changed, and there were some benefits clearly out of this as well. And I think we've managed to establish some really great sort of relationships that we're hoping to grow over the course of the next couple of years.
Clara, I'll come to you in a second to just pick up on Mike's point about building a digital ecosystem, because I think Inmarsat's done some interesting stuff in there. But before I do, I'll just remind you, if you want to ask a question, we're not doing roving mics for those of you in the room, so pop it onto Slido, whether you're here or whether you're in remotely, and now I'll start to come to ask those questions in the next few minutes. So don't be shy, and if we've got a great panel of experts here, so if you'd like to know anything, definitely put it into Slido. But Clara, this idea of building a digital ecosystem that is able to support innovation, I know Inmarsat's done quite a lot of work in that space in the last few years. Would you perhaps just tell us a bit about how that has evolved and sort of where you're at to now with the sort of CAP program and all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So we started trying to have a practical process around engagement and collaboration with startups more formally in 2019. At the beginning, we joined programs that gathered several corporations, so Inmarsat with several shipping companies, and together we would define some challenge areas and call for innovators. We found that was really useful in getting different corporates together, exchange pain points, understanding how we all fit together. And it was also great, to create a community of innovators within shipping companies and with enablers like Inmarsat. Where we saw the limits was, so thanks to this program, we found some great partnerships with startups, but where we saw the limits were in terms of collaboration between several corporates, or having the whole chain of startup, enabler, shipping company. So we decided to try a different engagement model. And last year, in collaboration with Thetius and Shell, we decided that we would commit to find an innovative solution for a crew welfare issue. And this winning solution would be trialed on a Shell vessel enabled by Inmarsat capability. So the idea was that it's not just about meeting startups, it would be about really having this tangible outcome, validating whether the technology works or not, and making sure that you get the most out of the technology, because we were looking at solutions where our capabilities could enhance the value proposition. So because they had better access to connectivity, higher bandwidth, or because they could have access to sensor data on the ship, etc. So yeah, collaboration is really at the core of what we're trying to do, and we're trying to replicate this model again. So, for example, now we're looking at doing it with the ferry sector. But just on one point that Mike said about the willingness of shipping companies to collaborate with startups. Last year, we sponsored another piece of research that we published in November. And we asked about 200 shipping companies, how do you procure external innovation? Do you go to established players? Do you look at more innovative, smaller outlets? And how willing would you be in the future to work with startups? And more than 50% said they would work with startups. Which doesn't sound like huge, but actually was very encouraging and surprising result.
And I think as well, what's been really interesting is the number of particularly in the maritime sector, the number of emerging CVC funds looking to invest. And the maritime sector as well has traditionally been very good at not just looking at corporate investment and partnerships, but also leading those to demonstrations. And as you seek external funding for a startup, that's absolutely critical. Having those use cases, those practical use cases across industries is really important. So good to hear.
Dan, can I bring you in on that? Because you're someone who's been selling to the sector for the last 2 years or so, and you've also been working with Nicholas at Bernard Sholto Interport in a kind of CVC type partnership. So it'd be really interesting to get your opinion on how that's worked and what have you learned from it?
I think that the first lesson I learned was the maritime sector is very hard on itself. I've personally found, working with other industries, that the maritime sector is actually very open to innovation. I think the challenges that it faces are, as we've discussed on the panel today, are very expensive challenges and costly. But our own experience was that I suppose getting access to data, getting access to the right people, and having an internal champion for each project or each partner even, that's effectively and coincidentally a human solution to the problem. So, but my own experience is I think the maritime space is quite it's a remarkable place right now. I think the shipping sector, in my humble experience, is potentially turning a corner, where as you described earlier, Nick, there are lots of new ideas, new solutions coming through, and I'm truly really excited about what can be done in both in the short term and the medium term. I'm very proud to be accepted by this fantastic industry. I suppose one of the things that we have noticed is, as an international sector, there are obviously cultural things we have to get round, such as communicating in different languages to crew, and also appreciating that the European mentality may not reflect elsewhere in the world. Similarly, we have things like the Jones Act in the US, which can be restrictive sometimes when we're talking about how we actually deliver projects. But I think none of these issues are insurmountable. So yeah, I'm really positive about what we can do in the maritime space, and we're open to any collaboration that we can get.
Fantastic. I'd like to open up to some of these questions that are coming in on Slido. The first one I'll come to is a question from Robert Kenworthy. Thank you for asking. Mark, I'd like to pass this one to you. We talk a lot about net zero and having a net zero ambition. It's very rare that we actually sit down and define it, and I know that Lloyd's Register has done some work in this space. So what does net zero actually mean to you?
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to answer that. There's the very sort of scientific way in terms of offsetting for the cargo and the emissions during transition of that cargo. But I think one of the things that we quite quickly bump up against in the maritime industry is, well, where does that offset start and stop? And clearly, the IMO, as a UN body, is responsible for maritime. But people forget, well, that's actually its remit. And I think what we've got to do as a maritime industry is really think beyond the remit of the decarbonisation regulations that have been put in place, because it plays back into, well, what do we actually mean by net zero? Because it's all very good sort of decarbonising maritime if then we're handing it across into another industry that then is, just putting it back into the environment. So really, when we talk about sort of cross-industry collaboration, that's where we want the industry to go, because at the end of the day, we're talking about the planet. We're not necessarily just talking about our industry. So net zero for us means not offsetting into another industry, not finding other ways to get rid of the carbon outside of maritime, but truly net zero for the betterment of the planet, really.
I think that's a fantastic point, that it's not just a shipping issue, it's not just a ports issue, it's a supply chain and infrastructure issue, and it goes so much wider than just shipping. Actually, Mike, I guess that's an area where you're having some experience sort of looking at the supply chain of building a vessel, but then also having hydrogen powered.
So we've just committed to net zero sort of from an entire supply chain perspective by 2024 as our objective. But the use of hydrogen is particularly critical when we're looking at zero carbon emission propulsion systems, which is the objective for 2025 for vessels operating in UK territorial waters. So by using liquid hydrogen as our primary fuel source, we're able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 99.1% well to wake. But what we realize is that actually there are still sort of impacts up and down the supply chain. So for instance, the prototype vessel we're building is made out of aluminium. That is massive sort of producer of greenhouse gas emissions through the production of the aluminium. So what we have begun to do is looking at things like 3D printing of hull structures, using recycled ocean plastic is one of the sort of technologies we're looking at. Fantastic companies, particularly actually in Scandinavia, looking at the size and scale of that type of printing that's required. We're still several years off, but that's the direction of travel.
Clara, I've got a question up on the board, and I think you'll be best placed to answer this. When will we finally have crew members able to have a seamless, cost-effective and stable connectivity experience? Will we ever get there? And if so, when?
I wouldn't put an exact date on it, but I mean, in terms of having an onboard connectivity experience that is seamless and stable and cost-effective, this is something we already enable through our fleet hotspot. But I guess the question is more about when will they have access to the same services than what on shore and on board, like watching their movies whenever they want on their device, playing games maybe, doing their own training whenever they want. And there is at the moment some constraints around the bandwidth that is available and the cost, but what I can say is that we are working on ways to make this more cost effective, giving access to seafarers to services that they couldn't access before. And it's again an approach that is about collaboration with external innovators and service providers to really have a platform approach and enabling that. But it's in the works, yeah.
And I think I'll use that opportunity to answer a question from Cathy Hodges. Thank you for asking. Unfair to put it to the panel because it's based on our research. She asked, I'd be interested to know how the maritime digital COVID leap compares to other related industry sectors. I think building on Clara's point, what we've seen is that really over the last decade, there's been a sort of backlog of fantastic things that have happened in the digital world ashore that hadn't yet started to happen at sea. And I think what COVID has helped is to create that leap. So I think it has been more pronounced in the maritime industry. It's such a 2020 was such a strange year to be doing any kind of market analysis because everything was just all over the place. But I can tell you that another industry that we track and where we've seen a similar bump is the kind of log tech sector. That's a land-based logistics technology, but that's principally down to supply chain issues. But equally, I think other sectors that are more land-based and don't really have this kind of connectivity constraint issue, it's much of a less pronounced bump, I guess. Mark, there's a question that I've just highlighted up there about the fact that we've talked a lot about the economic benefits of digitalisation, but is there enough focus on how we can improve safety for crew and for those actually attending ships? You're in the risk business. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. Lloyd's Register Group has one primary shareholder, and that's a foundation. And the role of the foundation really is to improve safety and life at sea. And within that, there are various sort of accelerator programs and investment initiatives that through the years, various organisations, various collaborations, various partnerships. But where we are at the moment is really no different. What are the major sort of safety or crew welfare challenges affecting the industry? And what we have seen certainly in the last sort of 24 months is the number of sort of solutions to those challenges coming to us from either tech startups like your own, Mike, or the use of data within maritime. Before it was things like boarding ships through rope and wooden pilot ladders is extremely dangerous. How do we change the physical pilot ladder to make embarkation safer? Now, for example, one of the things that's quite prevalent in the industry, as you know, are fires within container ship holds. And actually, if anybody's sailed on a container ship, you'll know actually it takes quite a while before the captain can actually see or understand that there is an issue deep within a hold of a 24,000 TEU container ship. So one of the solutions that as part of that accelerator that's come forward is really wireless smoke and heat detectors that effectively use the motions of the ship to power themselves, and then, as I say, use a wireless network to relay back what's happening deep within the holds. And clearly the advantage is that you can put these anywhere. They stick on. You can put many of them around the ship, and it gives you a much greater understanding of what's happening, and then gives you a much greater ability to react, to those, what we've seen, catastrophic incidents over the last 6 months on container ships. So it's things like that, that we continue to see, and as I say, more and more digital solutions and digital startup companies coming to solve those industry challenges that we pose through the LR Foundation.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I feel like we could go on for hours. So thank you all for your questions, and I'm sorry to those of you who we haven't been able to answer, and obviously thank you to the panelists. I think just from me as a closing thought, just building on your comments there, Mark, I know the company you're talking about, and I also know that the work to find that company and to start testing the solution, it's very much a deliberate effort to go out and find these innovative solutions. And I think when we look at the panelists that we have here, we've got 2 startups and 3 corporates, and Bernard Scholter have gone out and started their own venture capital fund. Lloyd's Register has the Safety Tech Accelerator. Inmarsat has the application provider program. It definitely takes a really deliberate effort to make these kind of innovations happen, and it's really, really exciting to see so many of the corporates in the industry doing it. And for startups like Mike's and Dan's, it's fantastic that there is a platform and a dedicated person that they can reach out to. So I would just recommend to everyone as a closing thought that there's just so much going on in the space. The challenges are enormous, but it's absolutely worth investing the time and the effort and putting the structures in place to make engaging with startups and innovators worthwhile. I'd like to thank our panel, Mike, Clara, Mark, Nicholas and Dan. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to be here and share your thoughts. I'd obviously like to thank everyone here today who asked a question, and those of you that didn't, and obviously everyone who's online, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for being here, and look forward to doing this all again sometime soon.